She watched her fiancé press his lips to her best friend's mouth in her own family's ballroom, in front of 200 witnesses, on the night the whole county had gathered to celebrate their upcoming wedding. Grace Fairfield did not collapse, did not plead. She walked straight across that floor, pulled the engagement ring from her finger, dropped it into his open palm, and said, without a single tremor in her voice, "I will not fight for a man who already chose someone else." The room went dead silent. And the most powerful man in Virginia, the man every woman there had dreamed of, couldn't take his eyes off her. Subscribe and stay with us, because this is the story of a woman who turned the worst night of her life into the beginning of everything. The Fairfield estate had never looked more beautiful than it did the night Grace's world fell apart. Every chandelier in the ballroom blazed with candlelight. The floors had been polished until they reflected the gowns of every woman who swept across them. The musicians played at the far end of the room, their bows moving in long, unhurried strokes, filling the hall with something that felt like a promise kept. The entire county had come, landowners and merchants, matrons in silk and daughters in muslin, because an engagement celebrated at Fairfield was an engagement worth celebrating. Grace's father, Colonel Aldous Fairfield, had made certain of that. He'd spent more than the estate could comfortably afford to give his only daughter the finest night of her life. Grace had spent weeks preparing, not for the spectacle of it. She'd never much cared for spectacle, but for the meaning. 6 years she had known Edward Whitmore. 6 years of Sunday dinners and long walks along the river and letters written in careful, patient ink. 6 years of being told, in word and gesture and assumption, that she was the woman he intended to spend his life beside. She believed it the way she believed in gravity, not because she chose to, because she had never once been given reason to doubt it. She wore a gown the color of winter cream that evening, with her dark hair pinned up and her mother's pearl earrings at her ears. Her youngest cousin had pressed a sprig of white jasmine into her hand right before she descended the stairs, and Grace had tucked it into her sash because it smelled like something good and steady, like everything she expected the future to be. Edward had arrived an hour before the guests. He'd kissed her hand in the parlor while her father watched with the satisfied expression of a man who believed everything was going according to plan. Edward was handsome in the way that made people trust him, instinctively square-jawed, broad-shouldered, with easy blue eyes, and the sort of smile that arrived just quickly enough to feel genuine. He'd pressed Grace's fingers and said the thing he always said. "You look beautiful tonight." She'd smiled. She'd believed him. She had no reason not to. The party filled the house quickly. Grace moved through it the way she always did, gracefully, attentively, making sure every guest felt welcome, checking that the musicians had refreshments, pausing to speak with old Mrs. Harrington about her garden and with young Thomas Alcott about his father's new mill. She was good at this. She had been raised to be good at this. Her mother had drilled it into her from childhood. A woman of standing makes everyone around her feel that they matter. Clara Bennett arrived just after the second hour struck. Grace saw her from across the room and felt the familiar warmth she always felt at the sight of her oldest friend. Clara was the kind of woman rooms noticed, auburn-haired and quick to laugh, with a sharp wit she rarely bothered to dim for anyone's comfort. They had grown up side by side. Grace and Clara, their families' properties adjoining. Their childhoods tangled together in the particular way of girls who share secrets before they understand what secrets are worth. Grace had told Clara about Edward's first letter. Clara had been the first person she'd shown the engagement ring. "You look absolutely radiant." Clara reached for both of Grace's hands and squeezed them hard. "Tonight is exactly what you deserve." "You're late," Grace said, but she was smiling. "I'm fashionably late. There's a difference." Clara looked around the room with bright, assessing eye. "Where is the man of the hour?" "Somewhere near the east windows, I think." "He was speaking with my father's solicitor the last I saw." Clara had nodded and drifted away, and Grace had turned back to her guests, and for the next half hour everything had continued exactly as it was supposed to. It was the stillness that caught her attention.
Not a sound.
Not a gasp, just a stillness set through the nearest cluster of guests like water spreading across a floor. A turning of heads, a collective held breath that Grace felt before she understood why she was feeling it. She turned. Edward stood near the wide doorway that led to the balcony corridor. He was not looking at Grace. He was looking at Clara, and the way he was looking at her was something Grace did not have an immediate name for, something private and unguarded and raw in a way she had never once seen on his face in 6 years of knowing him. Clara stood with her back against the doorframe, and she was looking back at him with an expression that Grace's mind refused, for just a moment, to process correctly. Then Edward leaned forward, and he kissed her, not on the hand, not on the cheek. He kissed Clara Bennett on the mouth, in the doorway of the Fairfield ballroom, at the party Grace's father had spent the estate's reserves to host, in front of every person in the county who mattered. The music did not stop immediately. It stuttered. The lead violinist lost his place, recovered, then trailed off, and in the silence that followed, Grace heard the sound of her own heartbeat with extraordinary clarity. She did not move, she did not speak. She stood precisely where she was standing, and she looked at the man she had planned to marry, and at the woman who had been, for as long as she could remember, the closest thing she had to a sister, and she felt something in the center of her chest go very, very quiet. People were staring. She was aware of that, the way a person is aware of rain as a fact, not a feeling. Edward pulled back. He turned, and when his eyes found her across the room, the color drained from his face so completely that for one uncharitable second, Grace wondered if he might faint. Grace. His voice carried in the silence. She walked toward him. She walked slowly and steadily, and the crowd parted for her, the way crowds always part for something they're afraid to interrupt. Her heels were quiet on the polished floor. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She did not rush, and she did not stumble, and she kept her eyes on his face the entire way. She stopped 3 feet in front of him. Clara was pressing herself against the wall beside the doorframe. She would not meet Grace's eyes. That, more than anything Edward had done, was the thing that made something cold and permanent close off inside Grace Fairfield's chest. She reached up and removed her engagement ring. The stone caught the chandelier light as she placed it into Edward's open palm, and she heard a woman somewhere behind her draw a sharp breath. I will not fight for a man who is already chosen. Her voice was steady. Terribly steady. That has never been who I am. Grace, please. Edward's fingers closed around the ring. It isn't within. Explain it to me. She looked at him with clear, direct eyes. Take your time. He closed it. In 6 years, Edward Whitmore had never once been at a loss for words, and the sight of him without them told Grace everything she needed to know about the weight of what he couldn't say. She turned away from him without another word. She walked toward the center of the room, and she picked up a glass of punch from the table nearest her, and she turned to face the 200 guests who were watching her with a mixture of pity and fascination, and the particular hunger that crowds develop for someone else's disaster. She raised her glass. Please, she said, clearly enough to be heard by everyone present. Don't let the music stop on my account. She did not cry that night. Not in public, and not in the carriage home, and not in her room when she finally closed the door behind her and sat down on the edge of her bed in the dark. She sat there for a long time in the silence, still in her cream gown, still wearing her mother's pearl earrings, the sprig of white jasmine crushed somewhere in her sash. What she felt was not grief, exactly, or not only grief. What she felt was the specific and particular sensation of discovering that something you built your plans upon was hollow, that the ground beneath a structure you trusted had been slowly giving way long before you thought to test it. She had given Edward 6 years. She had arranged her expectations around him. She had imagined, in that quiet, practical way of hers, what their household would look like, what their partnership would produce, how their children might divide his blue eyes and her dark hair. She had not been reckless about it. She had been careful. She had believed that careful meant safe. That was the part that kept returning to her as she sat in the dark. She had been careful. She had been so careful. Her mother came to her room around midnight. Margaret Fairfield was a small woman with sharp instincts and a face that kept its own counsel, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. Your father wants to speak with Edward tomorrow, she said finally. To understand what. Grace looked at her. Tell father there's nothing to understand. Edward made his choice clear enough that 200 people witnessed it. Grace, people will talk. They're already talking, Mama. She turned back to the window. The question isn't whether they'll talk. The question is what they'll say when they do. Her mother came in then, sat beside her on the bed and took her hand in both of hers. You don't have to decide anything tonight, Margaret said quietly. I know. Grace looked down at their joined hands. Her ring finger felt strange and unencumbered. I'm not deciding anything tonight. Tonight I'm just sitting here. She sat there until the candles burned down. The morning after the ball, every household in the county was doing the same thing, talking about Grace Fairfield. She knew it before she'd had her first cup of tea. She could feel it the way she'd always been able to feel the weather, not by looking at the sky, but by some shift in the air itself, some heaviness that preceded the storm. The servants moved more quietly than usual. The stable boy avoided her eyes. The cook, who always hummed while she worked, was silent. Grace ate her breakfast, drank her tea, put on her most practical day dress, and went to her father's study. Colonel Fairfield was sitting behind his desk, looking like a man who had aged 5 years overnight. He was 61, her father, with the straight back of a military man, and the particular grayness around his eyes that she'd learned to recognize as the face he made when something was wrong that he did not know how to fix. Sit down, Grace. She sat. I've been looking at the accounts. He spread several ledgers across the desk. I should have done this months ago. I should have done this. He stopped. Edward's family has been managing the Eastern parcels since your grandfather's time. The rental agreements, the timber contracts. All of it ran through Whitmore hands. And he looked at her with tired eyes. And the numbers don't add up. They haven't added up for some time. Grace pulled the nearest ledger toward her. She had always been her father's daughter. This, she thought, in columns and line items, in cause and consequence, in what could be verified and what couldn't. She ran her finger down the rows of figures and felt the wrongness of them immediately. These rental payments, she pointed. These are half what they should be. Yes. And the timber sales from 1,814 through last year, where did the revenue go? Her father pressed his hand flat against the desk. That is exactly what I am trying to determine. She turned more pages. The silence in the study was the kind that fills up with things people aren't saying. Grace felt the shape of it before she spoke it aloud. He's been taking from us. She looked up at her father. Not a question. Aldous Fairfield said nothing. The nothing was its own answer. She sat back. Outside the study window. The estate stretched away in the morning light, the fields her grandfather had cleared. The timber she'd climbed in as a girl. The tenants' houses whose residents had worked this land for 3 generations. She had grown up believing all of this was secure. She had grown up believing it would pass to her, and then, in the proper course of things, to her children. How much, she asked. Her father named a figure. Grace breathed through it. What happens if we don't recover it? We sell parcels. We reduce the tenants' contracts. He stopped again. Your mother doesn't know the full extent of it. I was hoping with the marriage. You were hoping Edward's family money would cover it. She said it without heat. And Edward knew that. Her father's jaw tightened. I believe he may have. Grace set the ledger down carefully. She folded her hands in her lap. A person watching her from across the room would have said she appeared entirely composed. A person watching more closely would have noted that her knuckles were white. Then we fix it ourselves, she said. Grace, I mean it, Father. We fix it ourselves. She met his eyes. I want to see every account. Every contract, every agreement, every rental record going back to grandfather's time. I want to know exactly where the money went, and exactly who benefited from its going. You're 24 years old, I am. She picked up the ledger again, and I can read a balance sheet. So let's start there. The county had certain expectations about how the next chapter of Grace Fairfield's story was supposed to go. The abandoned bride, and that was what they were calling her quietly, in parlors and at market and across church pews, was expected to withdraw. To become quieter, to take her humiliation and fold it into herself and emerge diminished, in the way that women who have been publicly embarrassed by men they trusted are generally expected to emerge diminished. What they got instead was Grace Fairfield appearing at the weekly farmer's market in a plain calico dress with an account book under her arm, asking pointed questions about unpaid wages. The first farmer she spoke to was Jonas Reeder, who had been working the northern barley fields for 11 years. He was a weathered, cautious man, with the particular wariness of someone who has learned not to expect very much from the people above him. Mr. Reeder. Grace stopped at his stall. I've been looking at the estate. Your last 3 months of contracted pay don't appear to have been delivered. He looked at her sideways. Were you paid? I was told there was a delay with the accounts, that it would be sorted. Who told you that? A beat Mr. Whitmore's man, the one who came around in March. Grace wrote this down. She looked at him steadily. You will be paid what you're owed, Mr. Reader. I am making you that promise directly. He stared at her for a moment with an expression caught somewhere between relief and profound skepticism, the expression of a man who has been promised things before. Then he gave a slow nod. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. She moved through the market and spoke to 7 more men before noon. What she found was worse than what she'd expected. Payments delayed, then quietly abandoned. Contracts redrawn without the tenant's knowledge, in language designed to benefit the person who'd redrawn them. 3 families had been reduced to living on half their contracted wages for over a year, sustained by the quiet dignity of people who did not know whom to tell. By the time she returned to Fairfield that afternoon, she had 4 pages of notes, a great deal of controlled fury, and the beginning of a plan. She was at her father's desk 2 days later, surrounded by ledgers, with a cup of cold tea at her elbow, when the housekeeper knocked to announce that a Mr. Henry Livingston had come to call. Grace looked up. Henry Livingston's name was known to her, the way weather patterns are known as something inevitable and significant that hasn't directly touched you yet. He was the largest landowner in Western Virginia. He was 36, unmarried in a way that was apparently more puzzling to other people than it was to him, and he had a reputation for competence that preceded him into every room he entered. She had seen him twice. At county functions, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark eyes, and the habit of standing slightly apart from whatever crowd he was in watching. She had not had cause to think much about him beyond that. She set down her pen. Show him to the parlor. She gave herself 2 minutes to tuck in a loose strand of hair and to feel something she identified as mild irritation, not at Livingston specifically, but at the interruption of work she needed to finish. Then she went downstairs. Henry Livingston stood in the center of the parlor with his hat in both hands. He was taller than she remembered, and there was something direct about his face that she noticed immediately, no excess of pleasantry in it, no performed ease. He looked like a man who said what he meant and waited to see what you'd do with it. He inclined his head. Miss Fairfield, I apologize for calling without prior notice. It's no trouble, Mr. Livingston. She indicated a chair. Please sit. She sat across from him. She waited. I heard about the accounts, he said. She regarded him for a moment. I imagine a great many people have heard a great many things about this household this week. Probably. He looked at her steadily. What I heard specifically is that you've spent the last 2 days going door to door through the tenant farming community cataloging unpaid wages and improper contract amendments. That is accurate. You're building a legal case. It wasn't a question, she answered it anyway. I'm establishing a record. Do you have a solicitor? My father has Mr. Hensley. He's been our family's solicitor for 20 years. Hensley is competent. A brief pause. But the Whitmore family uses Aldridge Purcell. I know who they use. Purcell has argued before the county magistrate 11 times in the last 6 years he met her eyes. He's won 9 of them. Grace was quiet for a moment. The parlor settled around them. Through the window she could hear the distant sound of the horses in the paddock. Why are you here, Mr. Livingston? He was still for a moment. Because I've been watching what the Whitmore family has been doing with their neighbors' land and money for the better part of a decade. And because you are the first person in this county who appears to be doing something about it. Something shifted in the room. She couldn't have named exactly what, only that the quality of the silence changed. You've seen it before, she said, in other estates. I've watched 3 families sell land they shouldn't have had to sell. His voice was even. Because the Whitmore's management contracts were designed to bleed them slowly enough that they didn't know they were bleeding. Grace set her hands flat on the arms of her chair. Then why didn't you do something? The question landed the way she meant it to, directly, without apology. He didn't flinch from it. Because I didn't have someone willing to open the books. He looked at her. Until now. The pause that followed had weight in it, the specific gravity of 2 people who have just recognized something in each other that they didn't necessarily expect to find. I want to see the contracts, he said, the originals. And I want to bring in my own solicitor, not to replace Hensley, but to work alongside him. Someone who knows Purcell's methods. This is my family's business, Mr. Livingston. It is. He didn't back away from that. I'm offering resources, not authority. The decisions stay yours. Grace studied him. In the 2 minutes since she'd walked into this parlor, Henry Livingston had not once tried to soften what he was saying for her comfort, had not once assumed she needed things explained slowly, and had not once treated the figure sitting across from him as anything other than the person capable of solving the problem she was facing. It was, she thought, a remarkably unusual experience. Come back tomorrow morning, she said finally. I'll have the original contracts ready. He stood, reached for his hat. Yes, ma'am. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame. Miss Fairfield. He looked back. What you did at the ball the other night. The way you handled it. A brief pause, in which she got the distinct sense that he was choosing his words with care. There are people in this county who've been telling that story with admiration. She met his eyes. Are you one of them? He held her gaze for exactly one steady second. Yes, ma'am. Then he was gone, and Grace stood alone in the parlor, listening to the sound of his boots on the porch steps. And she let herself, very quietly, draw one long breath. She had 4 pages of notes and a cold cup of tea and a great deal of work still to do. She went back upstairs to do it. The letter from Edward arrived 3 days later. She knew his handwriting on the envelope without having to examine it too closely. She had been reading his letters for 6 years. She set it on the corner of the desk and worked for 2 more hours before she opened it. He was sorry. He had always cared for her deeply. What happened between him and Clara had not been planned, had been in fact something he had been fighting against for longer than he wanted to admit. He did not expect her forgiveness. He only wanted her to understand. Grace read the letter twice. Then she set it down. She understood more than Edward Whitmore would ever know. She understood that he had spent 6 years telling her she was the woman he chose, while spending at least some of those 6 years choosing differently in the quieter places of himself. She understood that his family's management of her father's accounts, the delays, the disappearing revenue, the rewritten contracts had perhaps not been entirely coincidental to a situation in which Edward Whitmore needed the Fairfields to need him. And she understood that the man who had kissed Clara Bennett in front of 200 witnesses had probably not done so impulsively. Some part of him had wanted to be seen. Some part of him had been ready to be done. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer and went back to the accounts. She was not done with Edward Whitmore. But the way she was not done with him had nothing to do with love. Henry came back the next morning at 9 as she'd asked. He brought with him a solicitor named Calloway, a younger man, quiet and with the kind of focused attention that reminded Grace of a well-trained bird dog, and they spent 4 hours in her father's study going through every contract and account record that bore the Whitmore name. By noon, Calloway had found 6 separate instances of revenue misappropriation. By 2 o'clock, he'd found 9. He said at one point, sliding a contract across the desk to where Grace and Henry both could see it, was altered after your father signed it. The original language is still visible if you hold it to the light. Someone went over it in matching ink. Good work, actually, careful work, but they couldn't quite cover impression from the original pen. Grace held the page up. In the light from the window, she could see the ghost of different words beneath the ones that had replaced them. She said quietly, demonstrable fraud. Calloway took the page back with careful hands. If we can establish the chain of custody who had access to this contract after your father signed it, we have the foundation for a legal claim that would hold before any magistrate in this state. Henry was watching her from across the desks. She became aware of his gaze without quite turning toward it. How long will it take to build that chain? She asked Calloway. With your cooperation and with Mr. Livingston's resources to expedite the process. He considered. 6, perhaps 8. Then we begin today. She set her hands flat on the desk. What do you need from me first? Calloway reached for his pen. Henry poured her a fresh cup of tea from the pot someone had quietly left on the sideboard, and placed it within her reach without comment, and went back to reading the contract in his own hand. Grace picked up the tea. She looked, for just a moment, at the man sitting across from her, the calm steadiness of him, the way he engaged with her work, as though it were simply work worth doing, and felt something small and careful shift in the back of her chest. Something she did not particularly intend to examine. She turned back to the accounts. There was still a great deal to fix. The county expected Grace Fairfield to disappear. Not physically, they weren't cruel enough to wish that. Most of them, but socially. Emotionally. In the way that women who have been publicly humiliated by the men they trusted tend to disappear. They expected her to pull inward, to decline invitations, to develop a convenient ailment that kept her home on Sundays, to become, in the quiet and inevitable way of these things, a cautionary story that mothers told their daughters over needlework. What they got was Grace Fairfield standing at the edge of the North Barley Field at 7 in the morning, in a plain cotton dress and her father's old work boots, arguing with a supply merchant about the price of seed. Thomas Greer had been supplying the Fairfield estate for 15 years. He was a stout, self-assured man who had the habit of speaking slightly too slowly to women, as though the extra time were a courtesy. He'd arrived that morning expecting to conduct his quarterly business with Colonel Fairfield's steward. He had not expected to find the colonel's daughter standing there with a ledger already open. The price you've quoted here is 14% above what we paid last season. Grace ran her finger down the column without looking up. And there's been no shortage in the region that would account for that increase. I checked the Richmond market reports. Greer cleared his throat. Miss Fairfield, these matters are typically handled by my father's steward, yes, who has been telling my father that these prices were standard. She looked up then with entirely clear eyes. They aren't standard. So I'd like you to explain to me why you've been charging us 14% above the county rate for the last 3 seasons. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man recalibrating his understanding of who he was dealing with. Greer's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. There may have been an administrative error, he said finally. I thought there might have been. Grace closed the ledger. I'll expect a corrected invoice by Friday, and a credit applied to next quarter's order for the overpayments. She picked up the ledger under her arm. Good morning, Mr. Greer. She was halfway across the yard before he managed a response. Word traveled fast in a county where everyone knew everyone else's business by Tuesday of the week it happened. By that same afternoon, 3 other merchants had quietly dispatched messages to Fairfield inquiring about the status of their own supply agreements. The subtext being that they would very much like to resolve any discrepancies before Miss Fairfield found them herself. Grace found this privately satisfying in a way she didn't bother to hide from herself. She was not naive about what she was doing. She understood that every conversation she had, every account she corrected, every farmer she visited with her notebook and her flat, steady questions, all of it was being observed and discussed and judged by people who had already decided what her story was. She also understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to protect, that she no longer particularly cared. The engagement was gone. The reputation she'd cultivated as a careful, graceful, properly behaved daughter of the county had been dismantled in a single evening by a man who chose her best friend's mouth over his own promises. What remained after that was simpler. What remained was the work. She was 3 weeks into the work when she realized 2 things simultaneously: that the financial damage to Fairfield was significantly worse than her father had initially admitted, and that Henry Livingston had been coming to the estate every other day, and she had stopped finding his presence surprising. He came in the mornings, mostly. He would arrive with Calloway, and the 3 of them would spread documents across her father's desk and work through whatever Calloway had found in the previous 48 hours. And Grace would ask questions, and Henry would answer them. And sometimes he would ask questions back, and she would answer those. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the work had begun to feel like something she was doing alone. She noticed it one morning when Calloway stepped out to speak with the colonel in the hallway, and she and Henry were left alone with a stack of contracts between them. And neither of them immediately filled the silence with conversation, and it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like the silence between people who are thinking about the same thing. You knew about the Hartwell estate, she said, not looking up from the contract in her hand. Yes, the same pattern. Slowed payments, redrawn contracts, revenue that went somewhere it shouldn't. The Hartwells sold their eastern parcels in 1814. They believed they had no choice. His voice was even. By the time I understood what had happened, the land had already transferred. A pause. Yes. She looked up. From Whitmore. I did. He met her eyes without deflection. I didn't know at the time where it had come from. I found out afterward. He set down the paper he was holding. I've been sitting on it ever since, trying to determine the proper way to address what I suspect. And now, I have someone who opened the books. The thing she felt in that moment was not gratitude, it was something sharper than that, something with more edge to it. It was the recognition of being taken seriously by someone who didn't have to. If we can establish that the same method was used on the Hartwells as on my family, she said slowly, then this is not an isolated dispute between my father and Edward's family. It's a pattern, a deliberate one. Yes. Henry's voice was careful. And a pattern is a great deal harder to dismiss in front of a magistrate than a single complaint. Grace set her own paper down. She laced her fingers together on top of the desk. What happened to the Hartwell family? Where are they now? Robert Hartwell is in Richmond. He took work as a clerk after the sale. His wife passed 2 years ago. A pause. His daughter is 17. She thought about that for a moment. Would he speak to us? I believe so. I think he's been waiting for someone to ask. She nodded once and picked her paper back up, and they went back to work. It was another 20 minutes before she allowed herself to observe that Henry Livingston, the largest landowner in Virginia, the man every unmarried woman in the county dreamed of, was sitting in her father's study, helping her rebuild what someone else had tried to destroy, and that he had come back every other day for 3 weeks to do it, without once making her feel as though she owed him anything for it. She filed that observation away and said nothing about it. There was still too much work to do. The letter from Clara came on a Thursday. Grace saw the handwriting on the envelope and set it beside her tea for 2 hours before she opened it. She wanted to be in the right frame of mind, by which she meant a frame of mind in which she could read Clara's words without either crumbling or catching fire. The letter was 2 pages long, and it was, in its way, honest. Clara wrote that she had loved Edward for years longer than she could properly account for, and that she had believed, as long as Grace was engaged to him, that the only decent thing to do was to love him in silence. She wrote that she was not asking for forgiveness, only for understanding. She wrote that she missed Grace every single day. Grace read it twice. She sat with it for a while. Then she got up, went to the window, and stood there looking at the fields her grandfather had cleared. The part that made it harder was that she understood it. Not what Clara had done, not the years of silence, while Edward held her hand and planned their future, and wrote letters in careful, patient ink, but the love itself. The thing Clara couldn't help. Grace understood loving someone you believed you couldn't have. She had built her entire adult life around the assumption that Edward Whitmore was the man she was supposed to be with. And she understood now that she had done it not because she had chosen him in some blazing, certain way, but because he had been there, and he had asked, and she had believed that careful and steady was the same as right. She took a sheet of paper and wrote Clara 3 sentences. I have read your letter. I do not hate you, but I am not yet in a position to be your friend, and I don't know when I will be. She sealed it and gave it to the messenger and went back downstairs. Henry was already there, ahead of schedule, standing in the hallway with Calloway and speaking quietly about something that stopped when she appeared at the top of the stairs. She came down and looked at both of them and could tell immediately from Calloway's face that something had shifted. What did you find? She asked. Calloway opened the leather case under his arm and pulled out a folded document. The 1809 Land Charter. The original, not the amended version that's been in your father's files. Grace took it from him. She unfolded it carefully. Henry moved to stand beside her close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, not close enough to crowd, and looked at the same page. The difference was in 4 lines near the bottom. 4 lines that, in the original document, established a revenue-sharing clause that entitled the Fairfield estate to 30% of proceeds from any commercial timber contracts on the jointly managed parcel. 4 lines that, in the version currently in her father's files, had been replaced with language that said nothing of the kind. She read the original 4 lines 3 times. Where did you find this? She asked Calloway. Richmond Registry Office. Original charter filings are archived there. The clerk I spoke with said no one had requested this particular record in over 10 years. She looked at Henry. He was already looking at her. They didn't just skim the payments, she said. They rewrote the foundational agreement. They changed what we were legally entitled to receive. Yes, his voice was quiet. This goes back to 1809. My father was 44 years old in 1809. He's been operating under false terms, for she did the mathematics. 8 years, yes. The number landed in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. How much? She asked Calloway. If you calculate what should have been paid under the original clause, 30% of all commercial timber proceeds since 1809. How much are we talking about? Calloway took the document back gently. I've already done the calculation. He met her eyes. With interest, accounting for the market rates, in each relevant year you are owed somewhere between $9,000 and $12,000. Grace stood very still. $12,000 was not a sum that saved a struggling estate. $12,000 was a sum that transformed one entirely. She heard her own breath come out, slow and controlled, and she thought of Jonas Reeder at the market with his careful, wary eyes, and Robert Hartwell in Richmond working as a clerk, and 3 families who had sold land they shouldn't have had to sell, and she felt the cold, clean, purposeful anger that she had been carefully banking for 3 weeks now burn a little brighter. We're going to the magistrate, she said. Not in 8 weeks. We're going as soon as we have the documentation assembled. Calloway and Henry exchanged a brief glance. That may accelerate certain... I know what it accelerates. She looked at Calloway directly. I know it will put us in front of Aldridge Purcell sooner than we'd like. I know it will give Edward's family time to move money around before a judgment can be issued. I know all of that. A pause. What I also know is that Jonas Reeder hasn't been properly paid in 4 months, and Robert Hartwell's daughter is 17 years old. And there are people in this county whose lives have been contracted smaller by what this family has been doing. She folded her hands. I'm done waiting for the right moment. The silence in the hallway was very complete. Then Henry said, with exactly the kind of steadiness that she had come to recognize as simply his, all right then. Let's move. It was that afternoon at the weekly market that Grace encountered the first real indication of how the county's opinion of her was shifting and not in the direction she'd hoped. She'd gone for practical reasons to speak with the grain factor about adjusting the estate's autumn contracts, and she'd walked through the market the way she always did, purposefully and without particular self-consciousness. She was aware of being looked at. She was always aware of being looked at these days. What she hadn't quite anticipated was the specific quality of what she overheard as she passed a cluster of women near the dry goods stall. Can't imagine what she thinks she's doing. Running around with ledgers like a common clerk. Well, what else is she to do? No prospects, really, after. It's the Livingston visits I find curious. Coming every other day. You'd think if he had genuine intentions, he'd have said something by now. He doesn't have genuine intentions. He's managing a business matter. Oh, I'm sure that's all it is. The voice dropped, but not far enough. She's always been too proud. This is what pride gets you. Grace did not pause. She did not turn her head. She walked at precisely the pace she had been walking, reached the grain factor's stall, and conducted her business with the same attention she brought to everything. But her hands for just a moment were not quite steady. She had told herself she knew that people would talk. She had stood in the ballroom 3 weeks ago and told 200 guests that they shouldn't stop the music on her account. And she had believed, in that moment, that she was strong enough for whatever came after. She believed it still. She was strong enough, that wasn't the question. The question was why it still had to hurt this much. She was walking back toward the street when a hand closed gently around her arm. She turned, already composing her expression, already ready for whatever, and found Henry Livingston standing behind her, hat in hand, with the particular look on his face that she was learning to read as controlled anger being held very carefully in check. I heard them, he said low. I know you did, you don't have to. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. I'm all right. He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him working through some impulse toward protection that he was deciding how to manage without overstepping, and the sight of the effort he was making did something unexpected to the region of her sternum. There's something I want to show you, he said. Not today. If you can ride. Wear the Hartwell parcel. He replaced his hat. I think you should see it. She considered for exactly 3 seconds. I'll be at the Fairfield gate at 8. He nodded, and the thing that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, brief and controlled and genuine, in a way that the full smiles of more practiced men rarely were. Yes, ma'am. They rode out to the Hartwell parcel the next morning with Calloway following at a discreet distance, and Grace understood within the first 5 minutes why Henry had wanted her to see it. The land itself was good, rich, well-watered, the kind of acreage that a family could have built something permanent on. It had been in the Hartwell name for 40 years, before the contracts went wrong and the payments dried up, and Robert Hartwell found himself, at 53, signing papers he couldn't afford not to sign. The farmhouse still stood, empty now, with the particular look of a house that has been deliberately kept in good condition by someone who intends to sell it for maximum value. The fields had been cleared and replanted. Everything that had been built by one family had been quietly absorbed and improved and made profitable for another. Grace sat her horse at the edge of the tree line and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. The Hartwell family cleared this land, she said. Yes. Henry drew up beside her, Robert Hartwell's father. Took him 12 years, and now it pays into Whitmore accounts. Yes. She turned to look at him directly. You've been carrying this. He was quiet for a moment. Then I bought the land in good faith. When I found out what had been done to get it on the market, I couldn't undo the sale. But I could make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. You've been watching them for 3 years. He looked back at the farmhouse, waiting for someone with enough standing and enough anger to actually do something about it. The word anger landed without apology, and Grace appreciated that more than she could easily say. People kept trying to soften what she was doing, calling it strength, calling it courage, as if the fuel behind it were something noble and abstract. Henry called it anger, which was exactly what it was. I'm not doing this for nobility, she said. I'm doing it because my father trusted the wrong people for 8 years and paid for it every day and never told a soul because he was ashamed, and because Jonas Reeder worked land he wasn't being paid to work, because he didn't know who to tell, and because somewhere in Richmond there is a 17-year-old girl whose family had 40 years of work taken out from under them by men who counted on no one ever opening the books. He didn't need to. I want the Hartwell parcel, she said. Not for Fairfield, for them. When this is resolved, when we've established what was taken and who it came from, I want there to be a way to return what was taken. He turned and looked at her with the dark, steady eyes she'd come to read as his version of open. That will not be simple. No. It will require Robert Hartwell's cooperation and a separate legal mechanism. I know what it will require. She met his gaze. I'm asking if you'll help me do it anyway. The pause that followed was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man making a decision he'd already mostly made. Yes, Henry said, I will. She turned her horse back toward the road. He fell into step beside her, and they rode in the comfortable, working silence that had become, over the past 3 weeks, something she realized she had begun to depend on. She did not examine that realization too closely. There was still too much work to do. The summons came 4 days later. Not from the magistrate they hadn't filed yet, but from Edward himself. A message delivered by his family's man, requesting a private meeting at a location of Grace's choosing. Formal in its language, careful. The handwriting was Edward's, but the phrasing was Purcell's. She could feel the solicitor's hand in every clause. She read it tweeted on her desk and went to find Henry. He was in the study with Calloway, deep in a discussion about the chain of custody for the altered 1809 charter. He looked up when she came in and read her face immediately. She was learning that he did that. Red faces. Quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years in rooms where what people said and what they meant were rarely the same thing. She handed him the summons without comment. He read it. Calloway read it over his shoulder. The two men exchanged a look. They know you've been to the registry office, Calloway said. Yes. She crossed her arms. Someone talked. The clerk, possibly, or someone who saw us entering. Purcell will be advising Edward to settle quietly, Henry said. Before you file formally, he'll offer an amount that sounds significant, but falls well short of what you're actually owed, with a condition that you sign away further claims. I know. He'll try to make it feel like the reasonable option. I know that too. She looked at both of them. I'm not meeting with Edward alone. Henry set the letter down. You want me there. I want Calloway there with all of our documentation. A pause. And yes, I want you there. There was a moment brief, barely a breath, in which something moved across Henry Livingston's face. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise and more substantial. When are you thinking, he asked. Tomorrow afternoon. My parlor. She picked up the summons and moved toward the door. I'd like them to come to us. Edward arrived at 2 o'clock with Purcell and a junior associate whose role appeared to be carrying a leather case and looking important. Grace received them in the parlor, seated with Calloway on her left and a stack of meticulously organized documents on the table before her. Henry sat in the chair to her, right, not speaking, not looming, simply present in the way that a man who knows what his presence communicates chooses to use it. She watched Edward's eyes travel to Henry the moment he entered the room, and she watched what happened to Edward's jaw when they got there. He recovered quickly. Edward had always been good at recovering. Grace. He sat across from her. He looked tired, genuinely tired, and thinner than she remembered. And she felt the small, exasperating human pull of that before she set it firmly aside. Thank you for agreeing to meet, of course. Her voice was pleasant. Mr. Purcell, I understand you have something you'd like to discuss. Purcell was a lean, precise man who had the practiced ease of someone who spent his professional life managing other people's messes. He set his own papers on the table with a measured smile. Miss Fairfield, we are, of course, deeply concerned about the misunderstandings that appear to have arisen regarding certain estate management practices. My client wishes to address those concerns directly and generously. He slid a single sheet across the table. We are prepared to offer a settlement of $3,000 in full resolution of any outstanding payment questions, along with a revised contract going forward. Grace did not look at the sheet. She looked at Purcell. $3,000. A substantial sum reflecting my client's genuine desire to resolve. Mr. Purcell. She folded her hands on the table. We have the original 1809 land charter. Retrieved from the Richmond Registry Office 3 days ago. She watched the color in Purcell's face do something instructive. We have documented evidence of alterations made to the version currently held in my father's files. We have 9 instances of demonstrable revenue misappropriation going back to 1812. And we have correspondence from 3 additional families who experienced identical management practices under identical contract structures. The room was very quiet. Purcell's pleasant expression had not disappeared exactly. It had become a different kind of pleasant, the kind that is held in place by professional necessity, while something considerably less pleasant operates behind it. Miss Fairfield, he began. Additionally, Calloway said, in his quiet, precise way, we have requested a formal review date before Magistrate Corbin. That date, unless a satisfactory resolution is reached before then, will be in 3 weeks' time. Edward had gone very still across the table. $3,000, Grace said again pleasantly. Thank you, Mr. Purcell. We'll be in touch, and she stood up. Henry rose beside her without a word. The movement, both of them standing, the meeting over before Purcell had fully understood it was over, had a quality of completeness that Grace felt down to her boots. She watched Edward push back his chair and stand, and for just a moment, one unguarded, unintended moment, she saw in his face something she recognized as the precise emotion she had felt standing in the ballroom with 200 people watching her. The particular feeling of being on the wrong side of someone else's clarity. She looked at him steadily. Thank you for coming, Edward. She did not soften it. She meant it exactly as she said it. He walked out first. Purcell followed, with his associate and his leather case, and Calloway went with them to the door, and Grace and Henry were left in the parlor with the stack of documents between them and the afternoon light coming through the windows. She let out a slow breath. You're shaking, Henry said quietly. Not unkindly, I know. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking finely and precisely, the way hands shake after something that requires that much stillness. I'll stop in a moment. He said nothing. He simply stayed where he was, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him without having to ask for it. After a moment, she did stop. She picked up the nearest document, straightened the stack, and looked at Calloway when he reappeared in the doorway. How soon can we file formally, she asked. Calloway allowed himself a small satisfied expression. If we work through tomorrow evening, by Friday. Then we work through tomorrow evening, she said. She sat back down. There was still a great deal left to do, and 3 weeks wasn't much time, and somewhere in Richmond a man named Robert Hartwell was working as a clerk who deserved to know that someone had finally opened the books. She picked up her pen. The filing happened on a Friday exactly as Calloway had promised. Grace signed her name to the formal complaint at 9 in the morning, in her father's study, with Calloway witnessing and Henry standing at the window with his arms crossed and his back to the room, giving her the particular privacy of a man who understands that some moments belong to the person living them. Her father sat in his chair on the other side of the desk with the expression of a man who has spent 8 years carrying something too heavy and has just been told he can set it down. Colonel Fairfield reached across the desk when she finished signing and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Calloway took the documents and left for the magistrate's office before 10. By noon, the Whitmore family solicitor had received formal notice. By 2 o'clock, Grace could feel the information moving through the county the way fire moves through dry grass fast, in every direction at once, and impossible to call back. She was in the kitchen going over the autumn harvest schedules with Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, when the first reaction arrived. Not from the Whitmore family, from their neighbors. Margaret Delacroix, whose husband owned the adjoining property to the north, and who had been one of the women Grace had overheard at the market 2 weeks ago, appeared at the kitchen door without having been announced. She was 60, sharp-eyed, and had the expression of someone who had just been proven wrong about something important and was still deciding how to feel about it. "Is it true?" she asked. Not unkindly, which Grace respected. "That we've filed a formal complaint before Magistrate Corbin regarding financial fraud and contract manipulation by the Whitmore estate management?" Grace set down the harvest schedule. "It's true." Mrs. DeCroix was quiet for a moment. "The 1809 charter." "Yes. My husband signed a similar charter in 1811. Her voice was very controlled. "Similar terms, similar management structure." The kitchen went very quiet. "Mrs. Delacroix, I think you should come and speak with Mr. Calloway." By the end of that week, 2 more families had come forward. The Delacroix account records showed a pattern nearly identical to what Calloway had documented for Fairfield slowed payments over 3 years, a contract quietly amended in 1813. Revenue from timber sales on the managed parcels flowing into Whitmore accounts rather than returning to the family they belonged to. The Prescott family, whose land bordered the Whitmore estate to the south, had a worse story. Their patriarch was 71 and half-blind, and his son Franklin, a red-faced, tight-jawed man of 35, arrived at Fairfield with a box of papers and barely contained fury. "My father signed what they told him to," Franklin Prescott said, standing in the parlor with his box of documents clutched against his chest. "He trusted them. They were neighbors. We'd had dealings with the Whitmores for 40 years. He looked at Grace with an expression that was partly anger and partly something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "He didn't know. He still doesn't know how bad it is." "He'll know now," Grace said, "because now he doesn't have to know it alone." Franklin Prescott looked at her for a long moment. He set the box on the table. Calloway was already reaching for it. The case that had begun as a Fairfield family grievance had, within 7 days of the filing, become something considerably larger. Calloway drafted addenda to the original complaint, incorporating the Delacroix records and the Prescott documentation. Henry spent 2 days in quiet, methodical conversation with Robert Hartwell in Richmond, and came back with a signed affidavit and the look on his face of a man who has confirmed something he wished he'd been wrong about. Hartwell's situation is the oldest, Henry told Grace and Calloway that evening in the study. The charter manipulation on his property dates to 1806, 3 years before they used the same method on you. Grace did the calculation immediately, which means they refined the method on the Hartwells. Worked out the weaknesses. By the time they applied it to us, they'd already done it twice. At minimum. Calloway was making notes without looking up. "We may find earlier instances if we go back further in the registry records." "How many families are we talking about?" Henry asked. Calloway, "In this county alone?" "I believe somewhere between 5 and 8. Possibly more." The number settled over the room like something physical. Grace stood at the window with her arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular, working through what it meant. 5 to 8 families, years of careful, patient, deliberate extraction. Revenue redirected. Documents altered. Trust exploited so methodically that none of the victims had ever compared notes, because the kind of shame that comes from being financially outmaneuvered by people you trusted tends to fold inward rather than outward. Until someone opened the books. "Purcell's going to fight this," she said. "Not settle. Fight, yes." Henry's voice was steady. He'll challenge the authenticity of the original charter. He'll argue that any discrepancies are the result of administrative confusion rather than deliberate fraud. He'll put Edward on the stand as a man of good character who inherited a complex management situation and did his best. And the judge, Magistrate Corbin. Henry and Calloway exchanged the same brief glance they'd exchanged before. He's fair. He's also cautious. He won't rule against a family as established as the Whitmores without being very certain of what he's looking at. Grace turned from the window. Then we make sure he's certain. The hearing date was set for the second week of October. 3 weeks away, which was at once too soon and not soon enough. Purcell spent those 3 weeks doing what Grace had expected him to do. He filed motions challenging the chain of custody for the original charter. He submitted character testimonials for Edward from half a dozen county leaders. He let it be known, through the particular social channels that powerful men use when they want information to travel without being traced to its source, that Grace Fairfield's complaint was the product of a humiliated woman seeking revenge against a man who had broken her heart. That last one was the one that made her angriest. Not because it was effective, though it was, certain quarters, more effective than she liked, but because it required no particular effort. It required only the existing assumption, already present in the minds of who'd watched her walk through that ballroom, that a woman acting with purpose must be acting from emotion. That purpose, in a woman who had been hurt, was simply the respectable face of grievance. She heard it at church. She heard it at the market. She heard it in the studied silences of women who had been perfectly pleasant to her the week before, and in the careful phrasing of men who prefaced their greetings with an expression that told her they were deciding, in real time, whether associating with her publicly was worth the social calculus. It was Thomas Alcott, the young mill owner she'd spoken with at the ball, back in what felt like another era, who said it to her directly, which she almost appreciated for its honesty. "People are saying this is personal," he said, stopping her outside the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning. He had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. "That you're using the financial complaint as a way to strike back at Edward." "Yes, ma'am." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Alcott, are you familiar with the Hartwell family?" "Robert Hartwell? I know of him. He sold his family's land in 1814 after 9 years of contract manipulation that he didn't discover until it was too late to fight. He now works as a clerk in Richmond. His wife is dead and his daughter is 17. She held Thomas Alcott's gaze. "Is that personal? Does Robert Hartwell have a broken heart that he's trying to revenge himself for?" Alcott opened his mouth. "Or the Prescott family," she continued, without heat but without mercy. "Franklin Prescott's father is 71 years old and trusted his neighbors for 40 years. And the thanks he got for that trust was a set of management accounts designed to take from him slowly enough that he wouldn't notice until there was nothing left to take." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that personal, Mr. Alcott?" He closed his mouth. "When you discover the answer," she said pleasantly, "I'd be very interested to hear it." She walked on. She was 2 blocks from home before her stride slowed, and she let herself feel for just a moment how tired she was. Not physically, she could manage tired, but the specific exhaustion of having to justify the existence of her own case to people who would never have asked a man the same question. The labor of performing reasonableness while being systematically doubted. The weight of knowing that no matter how meticulous her documentation, no matter how airtight Calloway's legal arguments, there would always be someone in that courtroom or in that county for whom the most plausible explanation was that a woman had been left and was looking for someone to blame. She stopped at the corner of Market and Main and stood there for a moment, breathing. Then she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and turned. Henry had clearly followed her from the dry goods store at a discreet distance, near enough to intervene if she'd needed it, far enough back not to presume. He stopped when she turned and looked at her with the quiet assessment she had come to know as his version of asking if she was all right. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "I know you are." "I'm angry, I know that too." He fell into step beside her. For what it's worth, Alcott came out of the store, looking like a man who's just had something explained to him that he should have worked out himself. Good, a pause. "That won't change how he votes at the county council in the spring." "Probably not." Henry matched her pace, easy and unhurried. "But it might change what he's willing to say out loud in public about you between now and then." She glanced at him sideways. That's a very measured kind of optimism. I'm a very measured kind of person. It startled a short, genuine laugh out of her, the first one in what felt like a very long time, and she saw the corner of his mouth move in response, that brief and carefully controlled expression that she was increasingly aware of watching for. They walked the rest of the way to Fairfield without discussing the case at all, which was itself a kind of rest. 5 days before the hearing, Robert Hartwell arrived in person. Henry had written to him after delivering the affidavit, explaining the scope of what they'd found, the number of families now involved, and the date before the magistrate. He had not asked Hartwell to come. He had only told him what was happening and left the decision to the man himself. Hartwell was 56, thin in the way of men who have worked too hard for too long, with a careful, watchful quality to him that Grace recognized immediately as the particular dignity of someone who has had to find ways to keep it. He arrived in the late afternoon, was shown to the parlor, and sat across from Grace and Henry with his hands on his knees and his eyes moving methodically around the room, taking in the documents stacked on the table. "You found the original charter," he said, when Grace had explained what they had. "In the Richmond registry I looked for it." His jaw moved. "When things started going wrong, 1,810, 1,811, I started asking questions. The Whitmore man who handled our accounts told me the original had been lost in a fire. A fire at the county registry in 1,808. He paused. I believed him. The silence in the room was very particular. "There was no fire," Calloway said gently. "The records are complete and intact." Hartwell looked at the table. He breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate. He was quiet for long enough that Grace did not try to fill it, because some silences are people doing necessary work. "My father built that land," Hartwell said finally. 12 years of clearing and planting. He handed it to me in better shape than he received it. He looked up. "My daughter should be inheriting something. Instead, He stopped. "She's a good girl, resilient. But resilient is what you get when you take everything else away." Grace looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hartwell, I want to tell you what we intend to pursue, if you're willing to be part of it." She laid it out for him, the full case. The documentation. The hearing. The scope of what Calloway had assembled. And then she told him the other part. The part she had told Henry on a gray morning at the edge of the Hartwell parcel, when she'd said she wanted there to be a way to return what had been taken. Hartwell listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "You can't give me back 12 years, he said. "No," she didn't try to soften it. "I can't. But you're trying to give back something." "Yes." He looked at Henry. "And you're willing to restructure the land transfer formally, even if the court doesn't require it?" Henry said simply. Hartwell looked at both of them for a long time. Then he reached into his coat, withdrew a folded paper, and set it on the table. "I kept a journal," he said, "every conversation with the Whitmore accounts man. Every payment that came in short, every time I asked a question and got an answer that didn't quite add up. I wrote it all down because I didn't know what else to do with it." He pushed the paper toward Calloway. "I thought I'd lost my mind for a while. Thought maybe I'd just miscounted. That's what they make you think, you know. That you're the one who's confused." Calloway unfolded the paper with careful hands. He read the first page and something changed in his expression. "Mr. Hartwell," he said quietly, This is exactly what we needed." Hartwell looked at Grace. "Then use it." The night before the hearing, Grace could not sleep. She lay in her room with the window open and the sound of the night outside insects, a distant dog, the creak of the house settling, and she thought about every point Calloway had prepared her on, every likely argument Purcell would make, every piece of documentation she needed to be able to speak to fluently if Magistrate Corbin directed questions at her rather than at counsel. She thought about her father's face when they'd first spread the accounts across his desk, the gray exhaustion of a man who had trusted the wrong people and spent 8 years paying for it. She thought about Robert Hartwell's journal, 40 pages of careful handwritten notes from a man who had needed to write things down because he was afraid of losing his grip on what was real. She thought about Jonas Reeder at the market with his cautious eyes, and Franklin Prescott holding his box of documents against his chest, and the 17-year-old girl she had never met who would inherit a different story now than the one she'd been heading toward. She was still awake at 2 in the morning when she heard the quiet sound of someone moving in the hallway. She opened her door. Henry was standing at the end of the hallway near the top of the stairs, still dressed, clearly not having slept either. He turned when she opened her door, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the situation said enough on its own. "You're thinking about tomorrow," she said. "You're thinking about tomorrow," he said simultaneously. She leaned against the doorframe. He was a dozen feet away, and the hallway between them was lit only by the small lamp on the side table, and it was the most informal she had ever seen him. No jacket. Collar loosened. The careful social architecture of Henry Livingston, Virginia's largest landowner, stripped back to just the man underneath. She found she was not surprised by what was under the architecture. She had been seeing it in pieces for weeks. "What if Corbin rules against us?" she asked. Not because she believed he would, but because she needed to say the fear out loud to a person who would not try to make it smaller than it was. "Then we find another avenue." His voice was quiet and direct. "A higher court. Different jurisdiction. We have the documentation, Grace. We have the original charter, the journal, 5 family accounts, and a pattern of fraud that goes back 20 years. Corbin can slow us down. He cannot make what happened unhappen." She looked at him for a long moment. "You called me Grace." He was still. "I did. You've called me Miss Fairfield for 7 weeks. "I know." Something moved across his face, not quite the controlled almost smile she'd been watching for, but something deeper and less guarded than that. "I'm aware it may be presumptuous." She held his gaze for exactly one steady heartbeat. "It isn't." The hallway was very quiet. Outside, the night insects continued their indifferent course. "Get some sleep," she said finally, gently. "We need to be clear-headed tomorrow." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She almost smiled at that, the ma'am, deployed now like a deliberate callback to something private between them. She went back into her room, closed the door, and lay back down. This time she slept. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cool, with the particular crispness that Virginia put into its October air, as though the season itself knew something significant was happening and wanted to be appropriate about it. The county courthouse was a 2-story red brick building with a wide porch that had, by 9 in the morning, accumulated a crowd that had absolutely no legal business being there but intended to watch the proceedings from whatever vantage was available. Word had traveled. It always traveled in a county where everyone knew everyone and no story stayed contained to the people it directly involved. Grace arrived, in the black carriage with her father on one side, and Henry on the other, and Calloway in front reading notes and not looking up. She was dressed plainly dark blue wool, her hair pinned up, no jewelry except her mother's pearl earring, which she wore now because they were familiar, and familiar felt important on a day like this. She was calm in a way that was not performed. She had done the work. The work was done. What happened today would happen, and she would be steady through it. The courtroom was full. She had known it would be. What she hadn't quite reckoned with was the quality of the attention, the way the room shifted when she walked in, the silence that replaced the murmuring. She recognized faces on every bench, farmers and merchants and their wives. Thomas Alcott near the back, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Franklin Prescott with his father sitting very straight beside him. Robert Hartwell, who had taken the morning train from Richmond and was seated in the 3rd row with Calloway's deputy, looking at Grace when she entered with a nod that meant everything it meant. Edward was at the respondents' table with Purcell on one side and the junior associate on the other. He turned when she came in. She looked at him once directly, without hostility and without warmth, simply the look of a person confirming what she already knew, and then she looked forward and sat down. Magistrate Corbin entered at 9:30. He was a compact, deliberate man of 60 with reading spectacles that he used as a prop, taking them off to think, putting them back on to read, setting them on the table when he wanted a room to understand he was listening. Grace had done her research. He had ruled against 3 prominent families in the past decade, which meant he was either fair or politically courageous or both. She was counting on both. Calloway's opening was measured and precise, 14 minutes that laid out the chronology from the 1809 charter forward, establishing the pattern before touching the specific instances. Purcell's response was smooth and predictable. Administrative confusion. Complex inherited arrangements. A filing by a complainant whose personal grievance against his client was well documented. Grace watched Corbin's face when Purcell said that. His expression did not change, but he took his spectacles off, which she had learned meant he was paying particular attention. The first witness was Jonas Reeder. He sat in the witness chair with his hat in his hands and answered Calloway's questions in the flat, careful way of a man who is telling the truth and knows it and wants to be sure you know it too. He described the payment delays. He described the Whitmore accounts man who had come in March and told him it would be sorted. He described 4 months of working land he hadn't been properly compensated for. Purcell cross-examined him briskly, trying to establish that Reeder had no written record and could not be certain of the specific amounts. Calloway produced the accounts records. Purcell pivoted. The second witness was Franklin Prescott. The third was Margaret Delacroix, who took the stand with the composed fury of a woman who has recently discovered that her household has been managed against her interests and is deeply unimpressed about it. Then Calloway called Robert Hartwell. The room changed when Hartwell walked to the stand. Grace felt it, the quality of attention sharpening, the way the crowd on the benches leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Hartwell sat down and looked at Corbin and then at Calloway, and he told his story. He told it plainly, without theater, the way the truth generally presents itself, not with drama, but with the weight of accumulated fact. When he reached the part about the fire that never happened, about being told the original charter had been lost, about spending 2 years wondering if he'd miscounted his own accounts, the courtroom was completely silent. Purcell's cross-examination was measured, cautious. He'd clearly been warned by someone that Hartwell was a composed witness. He probed the timeline, questioned the specificity of the journal dates, suggested that memory over 13 years was inherently unreliable. Hartwell looked at him steadily. "The journal has dates, Mr. Purcell, written at the time, not from memory. The journal was already in evidence. There was nothing Purcell could do with that." Then Calloway called Grace. She walked to the stand and sat down and looked at Corbin, and then at Calloway, and then briefly, once at the room. She saw Henry in the second row, with his arms crossed and his eyes on her with the steady, hurting of a man who knows the person he's watching is exactly where they're supposed to be. She looked at Calloway. "Miss Fairfield," Calloway began, "can you describe, in your own words, what you found when you first examined the Fairfield estate accounts in September of this year?" She took a breath. And then she told it from the beginning, not from the night of the ball, not from the humiliation, but from the morning after, when she had walked into her father's study and sat down across from a man who looked like he had aged 5 years overnight and spread the ledgers on the desk, and she had run her finger down the columns and felt the wrongness of them before she could name it. She told it clearly, she told it precisely. She told it without anger and without sentiment, because the facts themselves, laid out in the right order, were angrier and more sentimental than anything she could add to them. Purcell cross-examined her for 22 minutes. He was very good. She had known he would be. He circled, and pressed, and rephrased, and came at the same points from different angles, looking for the place where her certainty would give way to qualification. He asked about her personal relationship with the respondent. He asked whether her investigation had been motivated by, and here he chose his words with great care, anything other than purely financial concerns. Grace looked at him with clear eyes. "Mr. Purcell, would you ask Robert Hartwell that question?" A sound moved through the courtroom, not quite a murmur. Something more like a collective exhale. Corbin took his spectacles off. "Miss Fairfield," Purcell said, with the precision of a man returning to solid ground, "isn't it true that this complaint was filed within weeks of your broken engagement to my client?" Yes, she didn't hesitate. "It was filed within weeks of my discovering that my family had been defrauded of $9,000 to $12,000. The two events were not unrelated, in the sense that the end of the engagement was what gave me access to the estate accounts for the first time." She looked at Purcell steadily. "It turns out that was inconvenient for a great many people." Courtroom was very quiet. Corbin put his spectacles back on. Purcell sat down. The recess was 90 minutes. Grace sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with her father on one side and Henry on the other, and she did not speak, and neither did they, which was exactly right. Calloway paced at the far end of the hall, going over his notes. Robert Hartwell sat across from them on the bench with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the floor. At one point Henry leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said quietly, "Just for her you were extraordinary in there." She looked at him. Don't what? Don't comfort me before we know." She held his gaze. "If Corbin rules in our favor, you can say whatever you like. Until then, I need to stay level." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back and crossed his arms and did not say anything else. But the thing that had been in his voice stayed in the air between them, like something waiting to be acknowledged. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. Magistrate Corbin was ready. Grace stood. Her father stood beside her. She felt Henry rise behind her, and Robert Hartwell across the hall, and Calloway folding his notes, and the sound of the benches inside the courtroom stirring as people understood that what they had been waiting for was about to arrive. She walked back into the courtroom. Edward was already at his table. He looked at her once when she sat down, a look she could not entirely decode because it contained too many things layered on top of each other. Guilt and grief, and something that might have been the final recognition that the choices a person makes in one season of their life do not stay in that season. She looked forward. Corbin settled. He looked at his papers. He took his spectacles off. "In the matter of Fairfield and Associated Complainants versus Whitmore Estate Management," he began. The room went absolutely still. And Grace Fairfield, who had stood in a ballroom 8 weeks ago, with 200 people watching her and had not broken, sat in a courtroom now with 200 people watching her, and breathed slowly and steadily, and waited for what came next. Magistrate Corbin took his spectacles off and set them on the bench in front of him, and the courtroom understood from that single gesture that what came next would require his full, unmediated attention. "In the matter of Fairfield and Associated Complainants versus Whitmore Estate Management," he began, his voice carrying the particular evenness of a man who has made his decision and intends to deliver it without theater. "This court has reviewed the documentary evidence presented by the complainants, including the original 1,809 land charter retrieved from the Richmond Registry, the journal maintained by complainant Robert Hartwell, the account records of the Fairfield, Delacroix, and Prescott estates, and the testimony of 6 witnesses over the course of this morning's proceedings." He paused. Not for effect. Corbin was not a man who paused for effect. He paused because what he was about to say required the room to be ready for it. "The evidence of systematic contract manipulation is in this court's assessment, not ambiguous." The sound that moved through the courtroom was not loud. It was more like a single collective breath released, the sound of a room full of people who had been holding something and were now permitted to set it down. Grace did not move. She kept her hands flat on the table and her eyes on Corbin, and she breathed. "The alterations to the original charter documents, the redirected revenue, and the pattern of delayed payment across multiple estates over an extended period constitute fraud under Virginia statute." Corbin picked up a single sheet of paper. "This court finds in favor of the complainants. The Whitmore Estate Management is ordered to make restitution to the Fairfield estate in the amount of $11,400, representing documented revenue misappropriation from 1,809 through the present year, with applicable interest. Restitution to the Delacroix and Prescott estates will be calculated on the same basis and presented to this court for formal order within 30 days. He set the paper down. He looked at Purcell. "Furthermore, all existing management contracts between the Whitmore family and any Virginia estate are hereby suspended pending individual review by this court. Any transfer of funds from managed accounts prior to the completion of that review will be treated as contempt." He looked at Purcell for exactly 1 deliberate second longer than necessary. "Mr. Purcell, I trust that is clear." Purcell's face had the quality of a man performing composure with enormous effort. "Yes, Your Honor." Corbin replaced his spectacles. Court is adjourned. The sound that broke loose then was not decorous. 200 people who had been holding themselves in check for 4 hours released into something considerably less organized, voices overlapping, benches scraping. People turning to the people next to them with the particular intensity of shared witness. Grace heard her father make a sound beside her that she had never heard from him before. Not a word, just a sound. Low and broken, and relieved in the way that things are relieved when they've been compressed past their natural capacity for a very long time. She turned and put her hand over his. He covered it with both of his and looked at her with eyes that had gone bright in the way of a man who is not going to cry in a courtroom, but is making no promises about what happens next. Calloway was already on his feet, gathering documents with the focused speed of a man for whom a favorable ruling is not the end of work, but the beginning of the next stage of it. Robert Hartwell, across the aisle, sat very still for a moment, with his hands between his knees and his head slightly bowed. And Grace watched him and understood that what he was doing was the private, necessary work of receiving something back that you had spent years believing was gone for good. Henry was behind her. She became aware of him without turning aware of him, the way she had become aware of him over 7 weeks, as a steady and grounding presence that she no longer had to look for because she had simply learned where it was. She turned. He was looking at her with the dark, direct eyes that she had long since stopped being surprised by, and in them was something that went well beyond the satisfaction of a legal outcome. Something that had been building for 7 weeks, in studies full of documents and market streets and county roads and hallways at 2 in the morning, and had been waiting with the particular patience of something that was not going anywhere. She looked back at him steadily. "We should speak with Robert." "Yes." The corner of his mouth moved. "We should." They moved through the crowd together, and Grace noticed the way the room made space for them, not with deference exactly, but with the particular awareness that people extend to two people who occupy the same gravity without quite acknowledging it. Purcell found her before she reached Hartwell. He stepped into her path with the controlled precision of a man executing a move he'd prepared in advance, and he looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally somewhat different. "Fairfield." He inclined his head. "I want you to understand that my client intends to appeal." She looked at him calmly. "On what grounds the chain of custody for the original charter document remains, in our view, insufficiently established. The Richmond Registry's own archival records established the chain of custody, Miss Purcell. They were entered into evidence this morning." She kept her voice even. "An appeal will cost your client money he is about to be ordered to pay, and it will cost him time before a higher court that has access to the same registry records." She tilted her head slightly. "But you know that. So I think what you're really telling me is that you intend to make this as slow and as expensive as possible in the hope that we'll accept a reduced settlement rather than continue." Something moved behind Purcell's professional expression. "The faintest acknowledgement of being precisely read. I think," she continued, "that you should advise your client that we won't." She stepped past him. Henry, who had heard every word from one step behind her, said nothing as she walked away. But she heard the sound of his boots falling into step beside her, and that was enough. Robert Hartwell was standing near the courtroom door when she reached him, hat in hand, with the look of a man who is still working out what has just happened to him. He'd been waiting 13 years for this room to say what it had just said, and 13 years is long enough that the saying of it doesn't immediately feel real. "Mr. Hartwell." Grace stopped in front of him. He looked at her. He looked at Henry. He looked back at Grace with eyes that were doing something difficult behind their steadiness. "I don't know how to," he stopped, started again. "I wrote in that journal for 11 years, and I never thought anyone would read it." "Someone read it," she said. He nodded once, tight and controlled. Then he put his hat on, straightened it, and stood a little taller. "My daughter," he said. "She doesn't know I came today. I didn't want to tell her until..." He stopped again. "I'm going to have something to tell her now." Grace felt the weight of that land in her chest, the particular, expansive weight of a thing that matters past its own immediate edges. "There's more we need to discuss," Henry said, "about the land itself." "When you're ready." Hartwell looked at him. "The restructure you mentioned." "Yes. It won't be immediate. There are legal mechanisms to work through, and it will take time. But it is something we intend to pursue with your cooperation, regardless of what today's ruling specifically required." Henry met the older man's gaze directly. "What was taken from your family was taken deliberately. The court can mandate restitution. What I can do additionally is voluntary, and I want to be clear that it comes without conditions." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Around them the courtroom was slowly emptying. Voices fading down the hallway, the ordinary noise of a county returning to its business, after witnessing something that would be discussed at dinner tables for months. "Why?" Hartwell asked. It was a genuine question, not a suspicious one. Henry considered it with the seriousness it deserved. Because I bought your land without knowing what it cost you to lose it. That doesn't sit right with me, it never has. Hartwell extended his hand. Henry shook it. And then Hartwell looked at Grace with an expression that she would carry with her for a long time, the expression of a man who had spent over a decade not knowing who to tell, and had finally, irrevocably, been heard. Thank you, Miss Fairfield, he said, for opening the books. The county reconsidered Grace Fairfield over the next 2 weeks, with the particular thoroughness of people who have been proven wrong about something and need to work out how to proceed. It was not a simple or comfortable reconsideration. The same people who had whispered about the humiliated bride seeking revenge now had to fold that narrative back into something that accommodated a court ruling, $11,000 in undocumented fraud, and 5 families whose financial situations were about to change materially. Some of them managed this with grace. Some managed it badly. A few did not manage it at all, and simply pretended they had always thought well of her, which Grace found the most exhausting response of all. Thomas Alcott came to Fairfield the week after the ruling. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and told her, without preamble, that he owed her an apology. I said what I said at the market, he began, and I said it because it was easier than thinking it through. And I was wrong. She looked at him for a moment. He was 28, and he was genuinely uncomfortable, and he was doing it anyway, which counted for something. I appreciate that, Mr. Alcott. He stopped. My father always said that the laziest thing a man can do is decide he already knows the shape of someone's story. He turned his hat in his hands. I was lazy. You were also not alone, she said. And you're here now. He looked up, relieved in the way people are relieved when they've been let off a hook they didn't quite deserve to be let off. She let him have it anyway. Life was too short, and there was too much work to do to hold on to things that had already been acknowledged. What she held on to instead was the work itself. The Delacroix restitution was calculated and ordered within Corbin's 30-day window. The Prescott settlement took slightly longer because the account records were in worse condition than anyone had initially understood. Which meant Calloway spent 2 additional weeks working through documents that somebody had clearly not expected anyone to look at carefully. Franklin Prescott called at Fairfield twice during that period to review the findings, and the second time he brought his father. Old Mr. Prescott was 71 and moved carefully, and had the eyes of a man who has learned, over 7 decades, not to expect very much in the way of justice. He sat in Grace's parlor and listened to Calloway explain the restitution figure, and he was quiet for so long afterward that Franklin put a hand on his arm. Papa? The old man looked at Grace. My wife always said we'd been cheated, he said slowly. She said it for years. I told her she was imagining things. He paused. She passed in 1814. Before any of this, the room was very still. I'm sorry, Grace said. And she meant it in the full, an unqualified sense. Sorry for the loss. Sorry for the years. Sorry for the particular cruelty of being right about something and not being believed. Old Prescott straightened in his chair. Well, she knew. He cleared his throat. I reckon that's what matters. After they left, Grace sat alone in the parlor for a while and thought about what it costs a person to carry the knowledge that something is wrong for years without being able to prove it, the slow, grinding weight of it, the way it wears at a person's certainty about what is real and what is not. She thought about Robert Hartwell writing in his journal. She thought about her father spreading those ledgers on his desk with the face of a man who has been ashamed for 8 years. She thought about Clara. It came back to her at unexpected moments still. Not with the sharp, specific pain it had carried in the first weeks that had changed, become something different, less like an open wound and more like the particular ache of a scar that has healed but not disappeared. What she felt now when she thought about Clara was complicated in the way that real grief is complicated. Sadness for a friendship she had genuinely valued. Anger that still had its edges. And something quieter underneath both that she was still working out. She had not responded to Clara's letter beyond the 3 sentences she'd written immediately after. There had been no further communication. That would need to change eventually. Grace knew this. Not because she owed Clara forgiveness in any formal sense, but because she had learned, over the past 2 months, that the things a person carries indefinitely become heavier, not lighter, and she had more than enough to carry already. But not yet, not today. Today there was still the accounts work, and the Prescott settlement, and the question of the Hartwell land transfer, and the new management contracts that needed to be drawn up for Fairfield now that Corbin had suspended the Whitmore arrangements. She went back to the desk. The conversation she'd been not quite having with Henry came to a head on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, 6 weeks after the ruling. They were in the study, not unusual, reviewing the revised Fairfield management structure with Callaway. The work was nearly done. The legal case was resolved. The restitutions ordered, the new contracts drafted. Callaway was, in his precise and slightly satisfied way, wrapping up the last of the loose ends. It was the kind of afternoon that has the particular quality of something finishing the work that had held them in the same room, day after day, for 7 weeks, was coming to its natural conclusion. Grace felt it without naming it, the way you feel the turning of a season before the temperature actually shifts. When Callaway packed his case and said his goodbyes and the sound of his horse faded down the drive, she and Henry were left in the study with the cleared desk between them and the late November light coming through the window, and nothing in particular that needed to be said about the case. She looked at the desk, then at him. "The work is done," she said. "Most of it." He was standing near the window, with his arms crossed in the way he stood when he was thinking through something he hadn't yet decided how to phrase. "The Hartwell transfer will take another 2 months through the proper legal channels. But the daily work, the coming here, the accounts, the documents." "Yes." He looked at her. "That part is done." The room was very quiet. "I need to ask you something," Grace said. She kept her voice steady, because the question deserved steadiness. "And I need you to answer it honestly." "All right. You've been coming here every other day for 7 weeks. You brought your solicitor and your resources and your knowledge of what the Whitmores had been doing. And you have sat in this room with me and worked through every piece of this, and I need to know whether that was about the case." Henry looked at her for a long moment. He uncrossed his arms. He set his hands in his pockets, which she had learned was what he did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "It started as being about the case," he said. "The first morning I came here, I came because I had wanted someone to open those books for 3 years, and you were the first person who had done it." "That's true." A pause in which the afternoon light shifted slightly. "It stopped being only about the case somewhere around the 3rd week." She looked at him. "When?" He considered this with the seriousness she had come to expect from him. "When you told Jonas Reeder you were making him a promise directly. And then you kept it." He met her eyes. "I have watched a great many people in positions of standing make promises to people who work their land. I have watched almost all of them fail to keep them. Not from malice, but from the ordinary human tendency to care more about the things that are immediately in front of you than the ones that require sustained attention." He paused. "You don't do that." Grace felt the weight of that land in the way that a genuine observation lands differently from a compliment, not on the surface of things, but further in. "I'm not certain what comes after this," she said carefully. "Not as a retreat, as an honest accounting. I have spent the last 7 weeks doing work that needed doing, and I have deliberately not let myself think about what comes after it." "I know. I don't want to be someone's project," she said. "I don't want to be a woman a man decided to repair." She held his gaze. "If that's what this isn't." His voice was quiet and completely certain. "You walked into this as someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and set about doing it. You didn't need repairing. You needed someone to open the door." She breathed. "And the door is open now." Yes, the study was very... Outside, the last of the season's leaves were coming off the trees in the wind. "Then I think," Grace said slowly, "that we might consider what it looks like for 2 people who have been working alongside each other to simply continue doing so. In whatever form that takes." Something moved across Henry's face that she recognized as the deeper version of the almost smile, not restrained but full, genuine, and considerably warmer than anything she had seen from him in public. "I think that sounds like a reasonable starting point," he said. She felt the corner of her own mouth move. "Very measured. As I said, Edward came to Fairfield the following week. Not Purcell, not a letter with solicitor's phrasing. Edward himself. Arriving on a Tuesday afternoon when the appeal he'd filed had been rejected by the appellate court within 10 days of its submission, the fastest rejection Callaway had ever seen from that bench, which he reported with quiet satisfaction. Grace received him in the parlor alone. Henry had offered to be present. She declined, because some conversations needed to happen between exactly the two people they were about. Edward looked like the ruling had been sitting on him. He was thinner than he'd been at the hearing. And there was something different about his face, not broken, exactly, but rearranged, like a landscape after a storm has moved through it. He sat down across from her. He looked at his hands for a moment. The appeal failed, I know. She regarded him steadily. Calloway told me. Purcell says there are no further viable options. He looked up. We'll pay the full restitution. All of it. Good. He was quiet for a moment. The management structure, all the contracts will be unwound. The revenue that was redirected there was a point where I knew, he said. I want you to know that I know that I knew. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, and Grace valued honesty enough to let it sit. I'm not asking you to forgive it, he said. I understand what was done, and I understand that I am responsible for more of it than I was willing to see at the time. He met her eyes. I should have told you before the ball. I should have come to you and told you the truth about Clara and about the accounts. I was a coward. I let things drift until they became something I couldn't pull back. Grace looked at him for a long time. She thought about the 6 years. The letters in careful ink, the Sunday dinners, the way she had arranged her expectations around a future she had believed in with the patient certainty of someone who has tested the ground and found it solid. What happened with Clara, she asked, not unkindly. Something crossed his face. He stopped. Things are complicated. Us. I see. He stopped again. She doesn't know how to face you. She's written to me about it more than once. Grace absorbed this. Clara, who had told her she missed her every single day, was apparently also telling Edward the same thing in different words. The complicated human geometry of it was something Grace had stopped trying to resolve neatly. What I did to you at the ball, Edward said, the way I let it happen in front of everyone. You deserved better than that. You deserved the truth told privately, with respect. And I didn't give you that. She looked at no. You didn't. I'm sorry, Grace. The words landed in the room with the weight of a thing that cannot undo itself, but can still in some reduced and partial way matter. I accept that, she said finally. For what it's worth, and for what it is, which is a beginning and not an ending. She looked at him directly. I don't wish you harm, Edward. I never did. What I wanted, what I still want is, for the people your family's management hurt, to have something returned to them. The money is part of that. The acknowledgement of what was done is the other part. He nodded. Purcell is drafting a letter. A formal acknowledgement for each affected family. Calloway will review the language. A thin edge of what might have been a rueful smile. I assumed he would. He stood. At the door, he paused. Looked back at her with an expression that carried the particular weight of a man who knows he is looking at a life he did not choose, and is only now fully understanding what that cost him. Livingston. Is it? That is not something I intend to discuss with you, not harshly. Simply with finality. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded, put on his hat, and walked out. She stood in the parlor doorway and listened to the sound of his horse leave the drive. She waited until the sound was entirely gone. Then she went back to her desk. The letter to Clara took her 3 days to write. Not because she didn't know what to say, she had known for weeks what she needed to say. But because the act of saying it required her to handle something delicate without breaking it, or setting it aside unfinished, and that kind of careful work has its own pace. She wrote 4 drafts. The first 2 were too angry. The third was too forgiving in the way that forgiveness sometimes is when it's performed rather than felt. The fourth was simply honest. She wrote that she did not believe Clara had set out to hurt her, that she understood, in the complicated way you understand things that are true and painful simultaneously, that love does not always arrive in convenient forms or at convenient time. She wrote that what had hurt her was not the love itself but the silence. The years of silence, the secret maintained at Grace's expense, the life she had built, around an assumption that she had not been given the full information to make. She wrote that she did not know if their friendship could be rebuilt into what it had been. She wrote that she was not certain it should be rebuilt into exactly what it had been, that perhaps what they had been to each other, as girls, needed to become something different, something built on different terms, if it was going to survive what had happened to it. She wrote that she missed her too. She sealed the letter before she could reconsider it, and sent it with the morning messenger, and sat for a while in the quiet that followed. Then she picked up the management reports for the Eastern parcels and went back to work. It was what she did best, going back to work. Henry had said it once quietly, not as criticism but as observation. You think through your hands, he'd told her, watching her organize a set of documents while clearly also processing something she hadn't put into words yet. She'd disagreed at the time. She thought he might be right. He came that afternoon, not for the accounts, those were nearly done, but with a legal document from his solicitor regarding the Hartwell land mechanism. She read it at the desk while he sat across from her. And she asked 3 precise questions about the conveyance language. And he answered them. And for a while, they were simply 2 people sitting across a desk doing the work they had come to do together. Then she set the document down and looked at him. I wrote to Clara today. He looked up. How did it feel? Necessary, she considered. And like something I should have done sooner, and also like something that couldn't have happened before now. She paused. Both of those things are true at the same time. That tends to be how the important things work. He met her eyes with the steady directness she had long since understood as his form of closeness. How are you? The question, simple, direct, asked the way he asked everything, landed somewhere in the middle of her chest. I'm good, she said. And then, because it was true, and because it was Henry, and because she had learned, over 7 weeks of watching him choose honesty over ease, to do the same. I'm better than I expected to be. And I'm not entirely sure what to do with that. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she'd been watching for. You could let it simply be true, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The November light fell across the desk between them. Outside, somewhere on the estate, one of the workers called to another, and the ordinary sound of the day continued around them. All right, she said. She picked up the Hartwell document. They went back to work. The Hartwell land transfer was completed on the 14th of December, on a Tuesday that arrived cold and bright, with frost on the ground, and the kind of sky that makes the world look freshly decided. Henry's solicitor had worked through the legal mechanism for 2 months, not a simple transaction, because the land had changed hands twice since the Hartwells had lost it, and each transfer required its own documentation and its own unwinding. But Henry had been patient with it, and Calloway had assisted. And on the 14th of December, in a meeting room above the county recorder's office with Robert Hartwell and his daughter sitting across the table, the papers were signed. Grace was there. She had not been asked. Henry had simply told her the date and time, and she had arrived, which seemed to be how they communicated the things that mattered most to both of them. Hartwell's daughter was 18 now, a composed, watchful girl named Eliza, who had her father's careful eyes and a directness about her that Grace recognized from somewhere closer to home than she expected. When the final document was signed and the recorder had witnessed it, and the land was again Hartwell land, Robert Hartwell sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Eliza reached over and took his hand. He covered hers with his, and he did not try to manage his expression, and the room was quiet enough that the sound of him breathing through it was audible to everyone present. Henry looked at Grace across the table. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing they could have said that would have improved on the silence. On the way out, Eliza stopped beside Grace in the hallway. She was taller than Grace had expected, with a self-possession that sat on her, like something she'd worked for rather than inherited. He told me what you did, Eliza said, starting with the accounts and the filing and all of it. He told me you did it, even when people were saying you were only doing it because of what happened at the ball. A lot of people said that, Grace agreed. Were they right? Grace looked at the girl. A genuine question, asked with the directness of someone who wants the real answer, not the comfortable one. The ball is what gave me access to the accounts, Grace said. If Edward and I had married, it's possible I never would have looked closely enough to see what was wrong. So in that sense, yes. What happened at the ball was the beginning. She paused. But what kept me going past the beginning was your father's journal. And Jonas Reeder's face at the market, and Franklin Prescott standing in my parlor holding a box of papers like it was the last thing he had to trust anyone with. She held Eliza's gaze. Those things have nothing to do with the ball. Eliza looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, with the particular nod of someone filing something away as true and important. My mother would have liked you, she said. Grace felt that land in the exact place it was intended to land. I think I would have liked her, she said quietly. December moved forward the way it does in Virginia, faster than it seems like it should. With the cold settling in steadily, and the evenings arriving earlier each day, and the particular social calendar of the county filling up with the events that mark the end of one year and the anticipation of another. Grace was invited to more of them than she had expected. This was itself a small revelation. 8 weeks after the ruling, the county's social architecture had quietly and entirely rebuilt itself around a new understanding of who Grace Fairfield was. The women who had whispered about the humiliated bride were now the same women who spoke with a particular proprietary pride about the young woman who had gone before magistrate court and won. The men who had been politely evasive when the complaint was first filed were now the men who shook her hand at gatherings and told her, with an earnestness that she accepted graciously, that what she had done was right. She did not hold the earlier behavior against most of them. People recalibrate, that is what people do. What mattered was where they landed. What she noticed, and what she found considerably more interesting than the social recalibration, was the nature of the conversations she was now having. Before the ball, before the accounts, before all of it, the conversations Grace Fairfield had at county functions had been the pleasant, surface-level exchanges of a woman in her social position. The weather, the neighbors, the ordinary commerce of a society arranging itself. Now people came to her with different things. Franklin Prescott's wife asked her about how to read a management contract. 3 women whose husbands handled the estate accounts entirely wanted to know what she thought they should understand about their own family finances. Young Alcott asked her, at a December gathering at the Delacroix house, whether she'd be willing to speak at the county agricultural meeting about the importance of registered land charters. She said yes. She said yes to all of it. Not from obligation, but because each request represented exactly the kind of thing that had been missing the circulation of information between people who had been kept from it. The ordinary leveling of knowledge that powerful men relied on ordinary people not having. Henry watched all of this from his characteristic position of slightly apart observation. And when she caught him watching, which she did, with increasing frequency, because she had simply learned where to look, the expression on his face was the full version of the thing she had been watching develop across 7 weeks of documents and courtrooms and cold November mornings. She let herself look back. The Delacroix Christmas gathering was the largest social event of the season, and Grace arrived knowing that it would be the first time she and Edward had been at the same function since the hearing. She had not avoided the possibility. She had simply not anticipated it until Margaret Delacroix mentioned, in passing, that the Whitmore family had been invited a decision. Margaret said with a slight edge in her voice, that her husband had made, on the grounds that social ostracism was not the same as justice, and justice having been done, the county ought to proceed with its ordinary business. Grace thought this was correct. She also thought it was going to be a complicated evening. She arrived with her father, who had recovered something in the weeks since the ruling, not his youth, but a kind of upright ease that Grace realized had been missing from him for years. The particular bearing of a man who is no longer carrying the weight of something he cannot name. He walked into the Delacroix house with his back straight and his eyes clear, and more than one person shook his hand with genuine warmth, and she watched him receive it and felt a quiet, settled gladness. Henry was already there. He found her within 10 minutes of her arrival, which she suspected was not accidental. Whitmore arrived an hour ago, he said low, beside her. I know, I saw him from across the room. Clara isn't with him. Grace absorbed this. No, she wouldn't be. She had received a reply to her letter 2 weeks prior, 2 pages, careful and honest, in Clara's familiar hand. They were not repaired. But they were, perhaps, in the early stages of something new, built on different terms, as she had written. It was slow and uncertain and entirely real, which was more than she had expected. Are you all right, Henry asked. Yes, she meant it. I'm genuinely all right. He looked at her for a moment, reading her the way he'd learned to read her, and accepted it as true. They were standing near the east windows when Edward crossed the room toward them. Grace saw him coming and felt nothing dramatic dread, not bitterness, not the residual pull of 6 years. What she felt was something closer to the ordinary solemnity of a person walking toward a conversation that needs to be had in a room full of people who are watching. Edward stopped in front of them. He looked at Henry first, a direct look, uncomplicated by anything except the acknowledgement of what was plainly in front of him. Then he looked at Grace. Miss Fairfield. He inclined his head. Mr. Whitmore. Hers was steady and warm in the way she had decided. Deliberately. To be not cold. Because cold would have been its own kind of performance. But the natural warmth of a woman who has put something down and is not picking it up again. He looked at her with the rearranged face she had seen in her parlor, the face of someone who has been through a storm and is still working out what remains. The restitution payments to the Prescott family were completed yesterday, he said. The final account. Calloway should have received confirmation. He did. Thank you. A pause. The gathering moved around them, conversations overlapping, someone across the room laughing at something that had nothing to do with any of this. I meant what I said in the parlor. Edward said quietly enough that it was between the three of them. All of it. He looked at Henry for a moment, another direct look, carrying its own kind of weight. She deserved better than what I gave her. I'm glad she stopped. Started again. I'm glad she's surrounded by people who understand that. Henry held his gaze without moving. Yes, sir, so am I. Edward nodded once. He looked at Grace with the expression of a man making a final accounting. Take care of yourself, Grace. I intend to, she said. You do the same. He walked away. Grace breathed once slowly all the way to the bottom. Then she looked at Henry. That was the last of it, she said. Not sadly. His voice was quiet, I believe it was. The county agricultural meeting was in the second week of January, and Grace spoke for 35 minutes about land charter registration, the importance of independent account review, and the legal mechanisms available to Virginia landowners who discovered discrepancies in their management contracts. She spoke to 42 people, farmers and landowners and their wives, a few younger men who managed estates for aging fathers, 2 women who had come alone because their husbands were away and they had decided that what was being discussed was worth understanding. Grace looked out at those 42 faces and spoke the way she had learned to speak over the past 4 months. Directly. Without softening the difficult parts. Without performing competence, she had simply developed through the work of doing it. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause, the silence of a room that has just had something explained to it that changes the way it will look at things from now on. Thomas Alcott started the applause. She noticed that, and filed it away as evidence that people can, in fact, keep recalibrating in the right direction if given enough time and enough reason. Henry was at the back of the room. He had not sat down for the entire 35 minutes. He stood with his arms crossed and his eyes on her the whole time, and when she found his gaze at the end, he gave her the slow, small nod that was his version of something considerably larger. After the meeting, while people were collecting their coats and filing out into the January air, Jonas Reeder stopped beside her. He had come alone, which surprised her. He still had the careful, watchful quality about him, but it sat differently now, less like the wariness of someone who expects disappointment, and more like the alertness of someone who has updated their expectations. That was something, Miss Fairfield, he said. He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture he'd used at the market 4 months ago. What you said today about reviewing your own contracts. My wife and I sat down last week and went through ours, he paused. Found 2 things we couldn't account for. Grace looked at him steadily. Did you write them down? Yes, ma'am. Bring them to Calloway. This week, if you can. He'll tell you whether they're worth pursuing. He nodded. Looked at her, with the expression she had first seen at the market, somewhere between relief and the residual caution of someone who has been disappointed before, and then nodded again, more firmly, as though confirming something to himself. He put his hat back on. Thank you, Miss Fairfield. She watched him go. Henry appeared at her elbow. Reader? He asked. Found discrepancies in his own contract. She was already thinking through the implications. If there are others like him, people who hadn't known what to look for until today. There are, Henry said. Almost certainly. She turned to look at him. Then we need something more permanent than a single meeting. Something that people can come back to. A regular accounting, a place where farmers and smaller landowners can bring their documents and have someone look at them who knows what to look for. Henry was quiet for a moment. She recognized the quality of the quiet as the one he used when he was not considering whether to agree, but how to build what she'd just described. You'd need a proper space, he said, and someone with legal training available regularly, not just Calloway on loan from another case. I know. That's a significant undertaking. She looked at him. Will you help me? He looked back at her. The January light was thin and clear, and the room around them was nearly empty, and there was nothing between them except the question she had asked, and the answer she could already see forming in his face. You know I will, he said. The idea took shape over the next 3 weeks with the particular momentum of something that has been waiting for the right conditions. Grace called it simply the Fairfield Land Registry Office, a name that was practical rather than grand, which was exactly what she intended. The space was a room at the back of the county records building, made available through a combination of Magistrate Corbin's goodwill and Henry's quiet negotiation with the county council. Calloway agreed to dedicate 2 mornings a week to it, and recommended a younger colleague named Marsh, who had recently passed the bar and was, in Calloway's precise assessment, both capable and in need of the work. The first session was a Thursday in February. 7 people came. 2 of them had discrepancies that warranted formal review. One had a contract that had been drawn up so vaguely as to be nearly worthless as a legal document, which Marshmish rewrote on the spot. The remaining 4 left with a clearer understanding of what they were entitled to than they'd had when they walked in. Jonas Reeder was one of the 7. He brought his wife, a compact, steady woman named Ruth, who asked better questions than most people Grace had worked with, and left with a list of follow-up documents to gather before the next session. Grace ran the room. Not as a lawyer, she was careful about that, clear with everyone who came through the door that Calloway and Marsh were the legal counsel and she was the administrator. But she scheduled the appointments and tracked the cases and maintained the records and made sure that the people who arrived uncertain and uncomfortable left with at least a clear next step, because she had learned that a clear next step is what the difference is between a person who gets help and a person who goes home and does nothing because the whole thing seems too large. Henry came on the first Thursday and the second. By the third, he had taken on the task of reaching out, through his own network of landowner contact, to families in the western counties who had similar situations but no proximity to the county records office. Grace noticed the expansion happening and felt something she had learned, slowly, to let herself feel without immediately managing it into something more useful, the particular warmth of watching something you built become larger than the room you built it in. She told him so one evening when they were going over the registry intake records at Fairfield, the study quiet around them and the fire doing its work against the February cold. It's already reaching past the county, she said, setting down the ledger. 3 families from Rockbridge wrote to Calloway last week. He forwarded their letters to Marsh. Henry looked up from his own reading. I know. I wrote to 2 county magistrates in that district. They're interested in a similar arrangement. She looked at him. You didn't tell me that. I was going to tell you tonight. She looked at him for a moment, the easy, undefended way he said it, the simple fact of it, and felt the warmth move through her chest in the steady, unhurried way of something that has been present for a long time and has simply been waiting to be acknowledged completely. Henry. His name in her mouth, without the formal prefix, without the miss or the mister, without the social scaffolding she had used when they were stranger-becoming colleagues, and colleagues becoming something she hadn't had a word for. Just his name, with the warmth in it she no longer felt any reason to contain. What are we doing? He set his papers down. He looked at her the way he looked at things he considered important fully, without reservation. I believe we're building something, he said. That's not what I meant. I know. He stood. He came around the desk, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that the careful social distance they had maintained for months was simply not present anymore, and he looked at her with the dark, steady eyes she had been reading for 4 months and understood at last completely. I have been in this room with you almost every day since September, he said. I have watched you go before a magistrate and testify with more clarity and courage than most men I know. I have watched you write to a woman who hurt you and choose honesty over both bitterness and easy forgiveness. I have watched you build something out of what was supposed to destroy you. He paused. And I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you that I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you do things like that. The fire crackled. Out the February wind moved through the trees. Grace looked up at him. She let the words settle, not rushing toward them or away from them. but receiving them the way she had learned to receive true things, steadily, with the full weight of her attention. That is the most thorough declaration I have ever heard, she said. The full smile, the real one, unconstrained by public setting or professional context, the one she had been catching glimpses of since October, broke across his face. I've had 4 months to work on it, she laughed. Short, genuine, the kind that arrives before you can decide whether to let it. She stood. They were the same height, nearly, and she was close enough now to see the particular way his eyes changed when he was fully present, no reserve. No management. Just the man he actually was. I am not the woman I was in September, she said. I want you to know that clearly. I am not the woman who was engaged to Edward, and I am not the woman who walked into that ballroom expecting everything to go according to plan. I have been changed by what happened and what came after it, and what you would be choosing is who I am now. She held his gaze. I need you to be choosing that, Grace. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. That is exactly what I'm choosing. She looked at him for one long moment, this man who had sat across her desk and called her anger by its right name and stood beside her in a courtroom and helped her return 40 years of Hartwell work to the people it belonged to, and she made her decision the way she made all her decisions, clearly, without flinching, with the full weight of her own judgment behind it. All right, she then yes. The winter ball at the Delacroix estate was held on the last Saturday of February, the same family who had come to Grace with their own account records 4 months earlier, now hosting the largest gathering of the season in a house that felt somehow lighter than it had before. Grace arrived on Henry's arm. She had not arranged for this to be a statement. She had simply arrived with the man she was accompanying, the way people do when they have made a decision and are no longer treating it as something to be managed. But she understood, the moment they walked through the door together and the room registered it, that would be received as a statement whether she intended it or not. She made peace with that in the 3 seconds between the door opening and the room turning, and then she walked forward. The county took it in. She watched the information move through the room, the slight recalibrations of expressions, the conversations that paused and restarted, the particular social arithmetic of people updating their understanding of a situation. Margaret Delacroix caught her eye from across the room and raised her glass with a look of such undisguised approval that Grace had to work not to smile openly. Her father was already inside, standing near the fireplace, with a posture she hadn't seen on him in years, the upright, at-ease posture of a man who is not carrying anything hidden. He looked at her when she entered, looked at Henry beside her, and his expression did the quiet, complicated thing that fathers' expressions do when they see their daughters standing somewhere they belong. He nodded, she nodded. Back was enough. They moved through the room, and people came to them, not the performative deference of people who want to be associated with a winning side, but the genuine warmth of neighbors who had watched something real happen over the past months and were deciding how to show that it had mattered to them. Jonas Reeder was there, with Ruth, and he shook Henry's hand and then turned to Grace and said, with the directness of a man who has stopped being careful, Miss Fairfield. The third session at the registry office last week, there were 12 people. 12. I know, she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen Jonas Reeder smile, and it transformed his whole face. Thomas Alcott found her near the refreshment table and told her, with the air of a man making a public commitment, that he had spoken to 2 of his father's colleagues about the registry model, and they were interested in sponsoring a similar arrangement in the neighboring county. She thanked him and meant it. Franklin Prescott shook her hand and said nothing at all for a moment, and then said, "My father asked me to tell you he sleeps better." She felt that in the same place she'd felt Robert Hartwell's daughter saying her mother would have liked her. Edward was not at the ball. She noticed his absence the way you notice the absence of something that had once taken up a great deal of space, with the mild, clean surprise of finding that space available again, and the gradual understanding that it had been yours all along. Music started. Henry turned to her. He did not command. He did not assume. He looked at her with the quiet, certain warmth of a man who has been choosing her, consistently and deliberately, since the morning he sat across her father's desk and called her work worth doing. May I have this dance? She looked at him. She thought briefly. of another ballroom and another question, and everything that had come between that evening and this one, the accounts and the courthouse, and the registry office and the 42 people at the agricultural meeting and the letter to Clara and Robert. Hartwell's face when the papers were signed, and old Miss Prescott saying my wife always knew, and the particular hard-earned clarity of knowing exactly what you're choosing when you choose something. She put her hand in his. She said, "You may." They moved onto the floor, and the music carried them forward, and around them the county continued its ordinary, imperfect, recalibrating business. Grace did not dance like a woman who had been rescued. She danced like a woman who had done the rescuing herself and had earned the right to be exactly where she was. Henry held her hand steadily the way he did everything. She had built a land registry office. She had restored $11,000 to her family and secured restitution for 5 more. She had gone before a magistrate and told the truth and won. She had written an honest letter to the woman who had been her best friend and was becoming something new. She had spoken to 42 people about how to read a contract, and 12 of them had come back the following week with their own papers. And 3 counties over, families she had never met were writing to Callaway because word had traveled. She had done all of this, and she was 24 years old, and she was dancing with a man who had chosen her because of exactly who she was, not in spite of her not in spite of her anger, not in spite of the inconvenient precision with which she pursued things that mattered, but because of all of it. Because he had looked at those qualities in a parlor one October morning and recognized in them not a problem to be managed, but a person worth knowing. Grace Fairfield had walked into the wreckage of everything she'd planned and built something big, and she had done it on her own terms, beginning to end without once waiting for someone else's permission to begin.